Our next speaker is Jack Kirby, who is Collections Interpretation Manager at Thinktank in Birmingham and my new best colleague in the Museums Trust. Over to you, Jack.
Right, that's it. Right, good morning, everybody. In 1802, Matthew Murray had a bright idea. He was trying to develop a compact steam engine to power machinery in mills and workshops. And this is what he came up with. Ooh. Not what he came up with. That's better. This is what he came up with. It's a design which does away with the usual beam and connecting rod by connecting the piston, I'm going to risk pressing a button again, by connecting the piston to a disc which rolls within a gear and is connected via a crank to a flywheel. And in this way, the straight line motion of the piston is translated into rotative motion in considerably less space than the standard beam engine designs of the time. And this design works at light loads, but it has a fundamental weakness. The piston rod crosshead the way it's linked to the gear behind it, it's on the pitch circle diameter of the gear, and it cannot be made strong enough to withstand greater loads. So in simple terms, it can't be scaled up, and for that reason, it never became popular, and we believe very few of these engines were made. What we do have, however, is the one on the left here at Thinktank in Birmingham. Its early history is actually unknown. We think it dates from around 1805, certainly earlier than 1810. It was discovered in 1927 in Stourbridge in an ironworks, together with a second example here, which is now at the Ford Museum in the United States. It has some differences and is probably slightly later. And our example was subsequently preserved by local iron founders before being given to Birmingham museums in 1961, and it is the third oldest working engine in the world. It's operated on steam but off-load since it came into the museum in the 1960s, and while these days we have a conservation management plan for it, it has seen quite a lot of repairs and modifications over time. In the early 1960s, various parts were replaced, built up by metal spraying. The crank and the guide rod bearings were replaced, and that was as a result of wear and tear in its previous life before it came into the museum. That was to get it going. There was probably some work in subsequent decades, in fact definitely, but it wasn't as well recorded. However, in the year 2000, a liner was inserted into the main cylinder because the cylinder walls had become very thin, and the piston was replaced as a consequence of that. So that's a fairly fundamental change, even if the original parts were retained. In 2004, the valve operating eccentric was repaired. In 2008, the transfer casting fractured. You can see the fracture there. And that was probably because of the way it had been fitted in the new museum in 2001, but it showed the fragility of the item. And in 2010, the cylinder, in spite of the liner, was found to be cracked at both ends and had to be welded. So again, a pretty major problem. So you have to ask, with 4 major repairs and some replacement parts in the last decade and earlier, is the engine simply worn out after 200 years, and should we cease operation? While evidence may be lost through interventive conservation, it's also occasionally gained. Here we found evidence of a pretty crude earlier repair on that fractured casting. And short of this kind of work that strips everything back, it's hard to know what may have been done to the engine in the past. We do, however, have a strong suspicion that the cylinder itself is not original. The casting is of a quite different quality to the cylinder base and cover, and there's also a suggestion that the main A-frames may not be original. So is it actually, rather than an original, is it an engine with a long and very checkered working life which has had many repairs and replacement parts? For me, the decision about operating the engine lies in the question of its significance. What is that significance? If the engine ceased to operate, what would it mean? And in part, that depends on who you are. For academic historians, you might think this engine was terrifically important, but in fact it's very little written about or studied. This element of Murray's place in history is assured by his patent of 1802 and John Ferry's 1827 book on the steam engine, which illustrated a similar one of these, as you see there. And remember, also, very little is known about the engine's life prior to the early 20th century, yet potentially it could be studied further. For visitors, it's displayed in our power-up gallery of engines. It, as one of the working ones, it does attract a much higher level of engagement. There's an interactive associated with it as well, and it's actually fascinating to watch. There's even a YouTube video that somebody who's not a steam engine enthusiast has put up of it. So we can say there would be reduced satisfaction if it ceased operation. However, the only people who would actually complain are enthusiasts, and they are very small in number compared to our 200,000 plus visitors per year. For the museum, third oldest working is part of what justifies the designation and the international claims for Birmingham Science Collection. It makes it a star object, yet interestingly, it didn't quite meet the original collecting policy of sound engineering practice because of that fundamental weakness I described, nor does it actually meet the current collecting policy because there's no Birmingham connection. It's black country but not Birmingham, and its significance may actually be largely in the third oldest operating status. And if it didn't have that status, what would it be? Still the eighth oldest engine in the world, the oldest non-beam engine, but mainly an interesting old engine of a failed alternative design. To consider the significance from another angle, returning to Murray's original idea of 1802, the 1802 patent is the written representation of the idea, the engine is the physical embodiment of the idea, and operation perpetuates the function of the idea. So should we be conserving the physical form, however much or little of it is left, or should we be conserving the function of Murray's design? In other words, should the engine continue to operate? Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Well done. So we move forward, an access operation issue. So I'm going to ask Rachel to respond to Jack's presentation.
When considering anything in the Code of Ethics, what I've generally discovered is there's never an answer, and I think Jack's really highlighted most of the main issues. For me, what I was thinking about with this presentation and the previous one is what does the audience, the visitor, see and understand about what's been done to the object in front of them? Do they think they're seeing it as it was in a sort of mythical past at some exact point? With a working object like this, I really do think as soon as it stops working, it can become invisible. And I think Jack's points about what is it if it's not the third oldest working steam engine are really key to my thinking on it. And I keep thinking about, in terms of industrial things, classic car restoration, and there's been changes in that profession, in that hobby recently, where people want to keep things working. And I think when Jack talked about enthusiasts, I thought, well, again, enthusiasts might critique how you've actually restored it, but again, isn't their approach to want to see it working rather than just preserved and eventually put away because nobody's looking at it anymore? The nature of an engine is it does wear out, bits need replacing. Jack says bits have been replaced. I think one of the things you need to consider is just where do you stop? And do you stop? Do you just keep replacing till you've got a new product? But it's still replicating that original, quite unique type of engine that hasn't been carried on. As soon as all of those engines stop working, will we know they exist? And will they just disappear into history, into a storeroom? The other thing you might need to consider is cost. At some point, it may cost you too much. You may not be able to afford to repair it. So it's weighing up the cost and the benefit to the interested users, to the people who stand and watch it. They're my thoughts. I don't have any answer for you, but I'm inclined to think it should be kept working.
Okay. You said you didn't have an answer, but you obviously do. That's great.
My answer, but it might not be anybody else's answer.
In some interesting points there, the object earning its keep effectively. I thought there was a bit of apartheid coming in there, Jack, by you saying, well, there's only a small bunch of people that won't notice if it's running, so do we just ignore their views? I think that's an interesting question. And then this idea of, well, what percentage does it have to be to make it authentic and real? Some key points. So let's open it out to the audience. I've got one at the front here. Again, just state your name for the record, please.
Chris Knapp from the Imperial War Museum. I'm not an advocate of running industrial objects, although I understand people like to see them working. The engineer in me likes to see these things working. My question is, how many times does it break and you keep repairing it before you decide, well, hang on, we've pushed this too far? Or if you're spending money on repairing it, why don't you build a replica or a working model now and have the best of both worlds?
The point about replicas, I think I always go back to what John Berger commented on in Ways of Seeing. The Mona Lisa is the most reproduced painting in the world, yet people still flock to the Louvre to see the original. There is something about seeing the original that really makes it for people. And in terms of the working, I'm not going to apologise for having things working in general, because I think to understand technological objects, they worked originally. Now, the point about, yes, does it wear out? We have actually reduced the frequency of operation. That's the third way. So we are now putting it under less strain than we were. There would be a point, clearly, where there was nothing original left. We're not going to get to that point. I'm doubtful about some of the decisions that we're taking about actually replacing parts in the past. But we are where we are. I think what would be really interesting would be to do some metallurgical analysis to find out how many different pieces of iron are in this engine anyway.
Mm-hmm. So controlled destruction, Jack, that's what you're advocating in this case?
Yes, but over a kind of geological time frame rather than a human one is what I would propose.
Okay.
Can I just come back? Yeah,
please, Chris, yeah. Use the mic.
On the Mona Lisa, it doesn't matter if one person or 1 billion people look at it, it's not going to wear out. That will wear out.
Oh. Come on, somebody's got to want to respond to that.
No, but things like
I think it's a necessary risk.
Jonathan.
Textiles, especially tapestries on walls, have to be lit to see them. They are being destroyed before. It's controlled destruction. It's accepted in a wide range of areas. I don't think there's anything wrong with controlled destruction.
Well, actually, we'll come to the front first, actually. This gentleman in the front row first. And then we'll come up to you, David.
Okay, cool. Peter Collins, the Waterways Trust. I'm just interested when you talk about the controlled destruction debate. We operate some of the vessels in our collection, but when we operate them, we generally have a backup to that vessel operating. Do you use the ability of backups? And when Chris was talking about using replica models, would you go down that sort of route if you think preserving this thing if it's so nationally significant?
Well, that's the point I was making about, is it actually significant? Because there is that static example in the Ford Museum in the States, so in some senses that is the backup, just as when the National Railway Museum have restored Duchess of Hamilton recently, the fact that we have City of Birmingham from the same class unrestored, and we would never work that one because that is in a near original BR condition. So I think in this case, the backup is having the one in the States.
Okay, thanks, Jack. We have another question in the audience.
In Cardiff University. There's quite a lot of mention about the audience and what they perceive, but are we talking in a vacuum to some extent as conservators about what we think it should be? And should there be a much larger survey of what people actually want from an object and what its function is as they see it, in terms of, is it a venerated object that doesn't move, or is the life of the object its actual movement? So is the data out there to support that in ethical terms? Because otherwise we're producing an empty argument.
We've started, but it's one of those things that's always on the back burner, some audience research, but I haven't quite got to the ethics point yet. My starting point is actually finding out what people think about our steam engines, and their ideas are exceedingly confused to start off with. So we'll get to the ethics one day, but yes, completely in favour of audience research to establish that.
We have one down the front that's going to have to be the last one, I'm afraid. Over to
Rob Payton, Museum of London. Was the decision not to run the one in the States and the fact that you're running one in the UK by default, or was it a planned strategy?
It was by default. Ford went round in the 20s, snapped up various bits of English engineering heritage that he fancied, and his one was never restored to working order. Ours, the policy from the 1950s onwards, was that we would have working engines. Mm-hmm. So it was acquired with that at least partly in mind.
Okay.
But there was certainly not any joined up thinking, however.
Thank you very much. We're going to need to move on. I just want to leave you one thought. You did say towards the end there, you said, I haven't got to the ethical point yet. So I think there's an interesting statement to make. It's at which point do the ethics begin? So I'm just going to leave that hanging there, and we're going to move on to our next speaker. Thank you very much, Jack.